Hello everyone. In the last class, we talked about consequentialism and non-consequentialism, and today we discuss a theory called hedonism. Now, you might have all heard of hedonism or hedon as a rather suspicious word. When we look at anything talking with hedonism, it seems to be something which is lowly, which is sensual, which is pleasure seeking. But let us look at hedonism as a theory, which is as a moral theory, and what does it really stand for. Now, hedonism describes pleasure, including the absence of pain, as the sole intrinsic good in life, right, as the singular intrinsic good in life. When we look at pleasure, and we look at it as the sole intrinsic good in life. So, that is something which is good in itself, that is also a goal, that all our acts should be directed to something which gives us pleasure. At the very surface of it, it seems pleasure is a loaded word, and it seems more sensual and something which is demeaning, or which is a shallow thing in life. But let us be charitable to hedonism, and as philosophers, as students of philosophy, or as curious thinkers, knowledge seekers, you need to step across the usual sense of colloquial knowledge, or the first impressions that we have, to go ahead and find out what does it mean in general, what does it mean in specific details, what does it mean as a theory. So, let us hit to the let us cut the chase and hit to the crucial word right at the start, that what do we mean by pleasure? Pleasure can mean various things, and because we need to define our terms well, that is how we make sense of our theory more accurately. And entire theories of hedonism, value theories about hedonism, differ depending on how they define theories. So, for some people theories are for some people pleasure is defined as sensual pleasure. For some people pleasure has been defined as intellectual pleasures. For some theorists it has been defined as aesthetic pleasures. So, depending on how pleasure is defined, we come out to understand what a particular value theory of hedonism means. So, is the pleasure the same thing as happiness? Now, that is a crucial concern that we shall have it sorted out for the moment to make sense of it. Aristotle talks about happiness. Aristotle talks about happiness as well-being. Now, when Aristotle talks about happiness as well-being, we look at the sense in which Aristotle talks about it is in the term of a cumulative long term thinking, a cumulative sense of contentment or peace that comes with a good life, and there that is distinct from what the hedonists would mean by pleasure as something which is discrete, which is some not necessarily or not a cumulative feature of life. So, it is not a cumulation or not a cumulative effect of acts, right. A hedonistic value theory admits of a variety of claims about the characteristic and types of pleasures, quantity or quality, intellectual aesthetic pleasures vis-a-vis sensual pleasures. Now, it is easy to think of hedonistic calculus as something which is looking at sensual pleasures and then demeaning it and then defeating it as an theoretical claim. But what does hedonism mean as a theory in principle? Well, it means that pleasure is important. Now, what is pleasure? Let us look at intellectual, aesthetic and pleasures of the mind or excellence, right. So, when we look at intellectual pleasures, the pleasure of reading a good book, of encountering a good idea, of going to a museum or watching a natural landscape, a moment of intellectual or aesthetic delight that one has looking at a beautiful painting, a sculpture, or a view of nature, or anything that one values, that itself as a goal seems to be what is desirable. So, sensual pleasures, yes, that is also a kind of hedonism, but that is not the only kind of hedonistic value theory. A hedonistic value theory can mean to hold intellectual values or aesthetic values also as something which is pleasant, which gives us pleasure, intellectual pleasure, refined pleasure as we call, and comes about to be a hedonistic theory also. Now, Plato's dialogue Philebus, and typically if we look at Plato's works, Plato, as you all might know, was a philosopher in the ancient times, and Plato advances his philosophies in the forms of a dialogue between taking place between two or more people, and each arguing for different theories, and then they are concluding with one claim. So, that is a way peculiar to Plato in how he has advanced his theories about his theories about many things in the world. In this particular place called Plato's Philebus, there is a dialogue that where hedonism is discussed, that well, it is a dialogue between one view that pleasure is the good, the true goal of every living being, one character holding that view, and what everyone ought to aim at, and the view that intelligence, knowledge and wisdom are better and more excellent than pleasure for all who are capable of them. So, he makes a contrast between two characters, one arguing for pleasure as the good, and that every living being ought to aim at, and the other view is where intelligence, knowledge and wisdom, right. This is versus pleasure. These are the two paradigms argued for. Now, this is a quote from William Frankena's books by Ethics, and in case you are interested to read further or to understand this further, you are welcome to visit at least these particular pages on the reading on hedonism. Now, look at this intelligence, knowledge and wisdom versus pleasures either refined or basal. That is a crucial claim that makes a difference. Now, intelligence, knowledge and wisdom, they are also a part of pleasure, they are intellectual pleasures. So, if one looks at say if I thought of an example that if a nation state uses scarce resources to build museums, to build art galleries, or to build monuments that give a sense of say pride or beauty or aesthetic delight to its citizens using scarce resources, it is committing to a value theory of refined pleasure seeking, and will still be under the character of hedonism, right. When we are looking at something that maybe even gives a sense of honor. So, when we are looking intellectual, knowledge, wisdom, we can also include the word honor. So, what do we anything that gives one pleasure, and let us contrast intellectual pleasures with theories that do not with non-hedonistic theories, to make sense that to give it a fair and equal competition, right. So, if we think of making aesthetic delights at one way, if you are a functionalist or if you believe in function, or if you want to claim function is more important than aesthetic or intellectual delight, then you might see expenditure or resources spent on aesthetic delights, resources spent on aesthetics, intellectual stimulation, in fact the humanities, as not giving you bang for the buck, or as a parliament perhaps not giving it bang for the buck. But if you look at a pleasure seeker, an intellectual pleasure seeker, that you encourage drama, you encourage fine arts, you subsidize performing arts, so that you want the society to be to revel in intellectual pleasures. So, this is nevertheless an hedonistic value theory, only the pleasure defined here as is intelligence, is knowledge, is wisdom, is aesthetic delights, right. Now, let us think of other examples, because the point of this course is that you constantly move from the world of theory to the world of practice, to the world of practice to the world of theory. So, you should be able to connect examples with theories and theories with examples. So, when you look around and you find, well, okay, this is a kind of an expenditure. Suppose you are a student and your college thinks of building an art gallery, or your college thinks of enhancing the library with non-trait books, books which are not essential to your particular trait. So, that in that sense the institute or your college is thinking of your intellectual growth as something that gives you that is a source of pleasure, and therefore, it should be subsidized. Here is a catch again, whether aesthetic delight or intellectual growth is a source of pleasure, or it is seen as something which is a must, even if you do not enjoy it, will again differ the chain of thinking. So, let us say, and as we have frequently discussed, that when we look at a single act or a policy, we can understand that there may be two or more differing compelling motivations for each of it, right. So, say enhancing the library can happen on two grounds of motivation, right. So, the first one is when it is looking at, let us take the first one, that knowledge, whether it is pleasant or unpleasant, is necessary, right. And there you can see the policy out there, and that is where you will be able to discover the strains of the policy. So, knowledge, whether the acquisition process is pleasant or unpleasant, it is deemed necessary, and therefore, it is paternalized or forced onto you. Now, the same when knowledge is seen as something which gives you pleasure, and therefore, it is non-trait books are added to the library, and without any schematic compulsion for you to read those books, perhaps no exams on them, perhaps no tests on them, but a library hour that allows you to explore the library. So, in that case, the motivation of course has been that it is a giving knowledge is seeking is giving you intellectual pleasures, and therefore, this is to be this option is to be exercised, right. So, I hope I have made it somewhat clear that how one could look at different theories. If this example looks a little complicated, you might even think of simpler examples, that anything that encourages hedonistic pleasures, right, and hedonistic here can be intellectual knowledge and wisdom pleasures also. There have been various kinds of hedonists also. Now, as you can guess, pleasure itself is a very porous and ambiguous term, and it can be you can see that it can be variously interpreted, and thereby it almost changes the theory that we the hedonistic theory. So, there have been quantitative and qualitative hedonists who define pleasure in different way. Quantitative as if more number of people to be happy, and qualitative that if a higher a better form of pleasure qualitatively comes about. Let us think of an example. Let us say the sense of and remember, as in the last slide, as we talked about pleasure including the absence of pain. Now, keeping this in mind, now if you go ahead and think of this example, that a government is spending on feeding its people, right. Now, in feeding its people, say it has a large mass of large citizenry of people who are underfed. So, whether they buy cheaper food, say typically carbohydrates, and make sure that it is distributed to as many as possible. Vis-a-vis, they try to invest their scarce resource into carbohydrates and proteins, which is typically more expensive than carbohydrates, protein, and try to give it to as many citizenry as possible. Now, ideally any government would like to provide food to the hungry, to its hungry citizens in their nutritional requirements, but I am asking you to imagine a hypothetical case where the resources are limited or the demand has been so high that one cannot fulfill, that the government cannot fulfill its demand in full scope. So, there it has to make this ugly choice between quantitative hunger satiation via carbohydrates or a qualitative hunger satiation for the few via having a balanced nutritional diet. The quantitative would be for many more people. So, a quantitative hedonist would say that we need to reach out as many people as we can, even though our standard or quality of food deteriorates. So, we just have carbohydrates, we do not have a balanced diet. A qualitative hedonist would say that we would rather, and this sounds cruel, but history has had examples of such qualitative hedonists, where they have invested in providing a qualitative support to the few rather than a general support to the many, even if the demand has been equally on both ends. So, how one defines pleasure, whether and how what kind of a hedonist one is, a qualitative or a quantitative. You can easily think of various examples where a qualitative hedonist versus a quantitative hedonist comes into being. You can think of, say, a software that a college or an institute would like to buy, a software that is required for a very few people, but niche people who can actually go ahead and develop it further and do some really path breaking work, vis-a-vis the same amount to be spent on a software that will be equally utilized by many more people. So, mostly we are familiar with in today's epoch as quantitative hedonists, where we look at the result of the menu. I can give you examples that, well, let us take think of India half a century back. Now, India formed the IITs half a century or so back, and that was a time when India was much scarce in resources, but it had to give a lot of resources to the IITs compared to, say, primary education or other institutes or other colleges, and with the hope that that was a qualitative hedonistic calculus. And here actually I am emphasizing the difference between qualitative and quantitative. So, for the IITs to do something path breaking for the development of the state, right. A purely quantitative approach to this would have been to distribute resources equally depending on the number of students any institute is supporting. So, that is an example of qualitative and quantitative hedonists. However, the key word here is hedonists, and hedonists are the one who are looking that, well, intellectual pleasures or what sensual pleasures are all that is worth gaining for. So, that should be the ultimate goal, and that is the only thing that is intrinsically valuable, right. And here you can see a close connection between consequentialism and non-consequentialism, because what is intrinsically valuable also becomes a goal for the consequentialist. So, think over it, and here is also the difficulties and porousness between definitions which are not watertightly separated. Now, before we come to the next slide, I want to think of tell you of a thought experiment, and I invite you to think of your own thought experiments regarding this. Now, let us look at what is a thought experiment, in case I have not talked about this earlier, and even if I have, just a quick recollection. A thought experiment is an imaginary situation that we put ourselves into, or that we define, so as to test both our theoretical position and the boundaries of our thought, right. So, let me give you an example and that will clear your clear this idea. Let us imagine, or let us call it a hedonistic chair. Okay. Let us imagine a chair that is all plugged with systems that can plug into your nervous system, and you sit in the chair, and once all the input is plugged into the nervous system, you can equate it with Matrix, the movie, or any other science fiction that you can see, and there you find that you are given you are taken to a simulated reality where you are given pleasure, right, whatever kinds of pleasure that you require, right. A clear and easy analogy to this comes is video games, right. And if in the future we have immersive gaming where you have a total sense of altered sense of reality, right. So, hedonistic chair, I can also think of it as video games where one is completely involved in it, getting the pleasure of an adventure, getting the pleasure of a conquest, getting the pleasure of a fight or of a race without facing the side effects or without being vulnerable to the risks of that particular pursuit, right. So, the risks are minimalized or they are cancelled. Now, if the risks are cancelled out and one sits on that chair and is continuously given a pleasure dose, let us stick to the hedonistic chair example, would you like to sit on such a chair, right. What is happening here? You have an altered sense of reality, you are plugged in and you have all the pleasurable experiences that you can imagine, you keep on it is programmed into hitting you. Now, if this happens, would one like to sit on this chair, right. Say your nutrition is taken care of and you are in an altered state of reality and your physical nutrition and body is taken care of, a classic equivalent of say a Matrix kind of a movie. Now, here the purpose of this thought experiment is to show or to explore whether if pleasure is all that we want and is and we seek that, then if we have a direct shortcut to get that sense of pleasure or that sense of whatever pleasure that may be, it may be sensual pleasure, it may be the pleasure of an intellectual pleasure, but if one is stimulating that particular part of the brain and getting those pleasures, would one like to sit on this hedonistic chair? Now, think of your answer whether you would or you would not. Let me guess out a few positions, right. One would like to sit on the chair, and then you get to have a life of absolute pleasure, especially the ones you want. 2, no, you refuse to sit on the chair because it is just not real. It seems that these pleasures are pre-programmed. What does this mean that it is not real? Well, 2a, it is not real because you are not facing the risks of the pursuit. Had you faced the risks of the pursuit, the realness quotient of the pleasure would go up. Second, 3, one could argue that well, this is really not pleasure and this is perhaps what we really do not want, because we want the joy of pursuit, we want happiness, we do not want pleasure, we do not want that particular sensation or that slice of experience independent of the drama and the journey that precedes the arrival of that slice of experience. So, we do not require that particular shortcut. So, a reason, now look at it, what are the practical implications of it? If we look at the domain of video games, now online gaming, should that be, is there something wrong with it, or should that be encouraged, should that be discouraged if people spend a huge amount of time gaming? So, there are many assumptions and questions hidden into it, but we will stick to the hedonistic questions right now, that video games or virtual reality or even pornography, all of these are examples of a virtual world which is targeting pleasure without the effort or without the process to be the usual process to be followed, right. Now, in this one way of looking at it is, well, the joy and where you will step away from the hedonistic calculus or the hedonistic theory, is that you look at the joy of say climbing a mountain true and fulfilling only if you go through the risks and the training required to actually do that experience, rather than sit on a video game and have those experiences made available to you, however engrossing or embedded it is, right. So, the joy is not in that particular feeling that you get in summit. Say you have a brain state when you reach the summit, and that brain state is miraculously being created for you, and you believe that. So, it is a brain state that you are not targeting, rather this is I am talking about the non-hedonist. This is a brain state that the hedonist may target, but the non-hedonist or the non-hedonistic theories would say that, well, this is really not what we should be targeting, there is something else that should be targeted, right. So, I am sure you can think of many examples in this regard, but and go ahead and look at the way we look at the various examples that you find in real world, and see where you find a hedonistic motivation or a hedonistic value theory powering that particular policy. One should know the difference between psychological hedonism and ethical hedonism. So, if we start from the foundation of naturalism, that we see that, well, if we look that morality aside, people naturally seek pleasure. If this becomes a fact that, well, it is natural for us to seek pleasure, maybe biological fact, this is of course termed as psychological hedonism. And on the basis of that, when we make a judgment that therefore, morally we should seek pleasure, because something is natural, that is the reason for us to make it moral. Look at this reasoning and see if you can follow this up. Anything that is natural, naturally we seek pleasure, and therefore, we ought to seek pleasure, right. This is a classic case of how we move from an is to an ought, right. Is a state of affairs, is the current state of affairs, right. Ought is a prescription. This is a description, and this is a prescription. So, because things are the way we are naturally biologically pleasure seeking creatures, pain avoiding creatures, therefore, we should be also that should or that ought, we ought to be looking for pleasure, and that is what is morally how we should go ahead and do it. Now, so far I have tried to argue for hedonism as a value theory to give it a sound understanding, because it is easy to dismiss hedonism as a moral theory, because when we particularly build it as a straw man argument, we look at hedonism as looking for sense gratification, and therefore, it is an undesirable value theory. But if we change the denotation of pleasure from sensual gratification to intellectual pleasures to aesthetic pleasures to wisdom to knowledge, then hedonism becomes a much more seriously taken theory. There is, however, one particular paradox of hedonism that one must be aware of, and is what is perhaps the most difficult objection for hedonism to overcome, is that many of the deepest, and I quote from the Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy, many of the deepest and best pleasures of life, say of love, child rearing or work, seem to come most often to those who are engaging in an activity for reason other than pleasure seeking, right. Look, listen to this carefully, that most of the acts that we find giving us meaning, give us meaning when we are actually not looking for pleasure in that particular act, right. Say the act of love or work or child rearing, that you are not looking for pleasure in every moment of that act. So, let us say analogically, you are there to watch a movie. Now, at every scene of the movie, you are not telling yourself that, oh, I am enjoying this movie, yes, this is giving me pleasure, yes, I am enjoying it. For a moment, you need to be into the flow of the movie for really to have a sense of enjoyment at the end of it. So, the paradox of hedonism is that if you chase pleasure, you are unlikely to get it, and you get pleasure only when you do not chase pleasure, right. So, this is a standard critique of hedonism that talks about the paradox of hedonism, that when you chase pleasure, you are unlikely to get it, but when you do not chase it and immerse yourself in the pursuit, pleasure comes as a side effect. So, the hedonists are making a mistake by putting what is a side effect or what ought to be a cumulative effect as the immediate target of an act, right. So, with this we come to the end of hedonism, and hedonism is of course a moral theory that is often underrepresented and refuted, but as I hope to have shown that this is not the case. It is a serious moral theory that can argue, depending on the kinds of pleasure that one values, it can make a very significant moral theory for conditions to work. Thank you.